This week, scientists say weather records dating back more than a century show the Adirondacks are warming, nearly twice the global average.
The largest warming that we've experienced is during the wintertime.
It's already forcing ski resorts to adapt to shorter, warmer winters.
30% of our economy here is based on winter activity. And so that is something that can affect this region tremendously.
What effect is it having on wildlife and their habitat? Could warming temperatures drive this rare migratory songbird from its nesting grounds in the high peaks?
The whole issue of climate change is the sort of overlaying threat that we're most profoundly worried about in the long term.
And could it be helping invasive species spread further into the Adirondacks? Join us this week for a Mountain Lake Journal Community Forum as we bring together a panel of experts to talk about the impact climate change is having on the Adirondacks.
Mountain Lake Journal on Mountain Lake PBS is made possible in part by
Northline Utilities creates employment and training opportunities for North Country residents with projects that build community and social infrastructure. We're family-focused and education-oriented. Power is our business and pride is our choice.
Knight Automotive, featuring a full selection of the entire Buick lineup in stock, with certified technicians in our service department and a well-stocked parts department. Knight Automotive, Route 3, Plattsburgh, New York. Lakes to Locks Passage, working to stimulate the health and vibrancy of our communities through nurturing our culture and heritage. Discover local history and unique travel ideas for New York's Great Northeast Journey at lakestolocks.org. The team at International Paper Ticonderoga Mill proudly supports Lakes to Locks Passage and Mountain Lake PBS.
Twin State Technologies. The cyber threat tempo, including ransomware, is real. Twin State Technologies provides trusted, innovative services that replace, augment, or update your existing system. Our goal is to stop hacking before it starts. Implementing big business solutions geared for the small business market. Twin State Technologies. Connect, protect, respond. More at twinstate.com.
The climate is changing, and we need places where nature is left alone, where we can watch natural processes work themselves out.
The Adirondacks are one of the largest and most intact temperate mixed deciduous forests left on the globe. And because of that global significance, our obligation to do conservation work here is really important.
This program is part of Peril and Promise, a national public media initiative from WNET in New York, exploring the impact of climate change here in the Adirondacks and around the world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Hemlock. This week, we're hosting a community forum to talk about global warming. Many people would never think to include the Adirondack Mountains among the places on Earth being threatened by climate change. But climate scientists at SUNY Plattsburgh have discovered over the past several decades, the Adirondacks have been warming faster than much of the planet, about 2 times the global average. And they predict within the next few decades, if we stay on the current course, that rise in temperature will double again. While there are days the high peaks are still among the coldest places on Earth, over the past several decades, the length of our winter season in the Adirondacks is getting shorter and temperatures warmer.
The largest warming that we've experienced is during the wintertime.
Dr. Eric Leibensberger, an atmospheric scientist at SUNY Plattsburgh, has spent the last several years recording and tracking air and water temperatures in the Adirondacks and Lake Champlain. After last summer's dire warning by the United Nations that many spots on Earth could feel the significant effects of climate change within the next couple of decades, Leibensberger and Alexandria Elliott, one of his earth science students, started analyzing just how much the temperatures in the Adirondacks and North Country have changed. Poring over data from the past century, they found the Adirondacks are warming faster than many other parts of the planet.
The temperatures have gone up about 2 degrees Celsius, or about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a big number. It sounds like a small number, but it's a big number, and our warming so far on the global scale is about 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So the warming that we've experienced in the Adirondacks is about double that.
And Leibensperger believes that increase may double again within the next 3 or 4 decades if carbon emissions remain as they are, which he says could be a game changer for the alpine landscape and the high peaks, for certain fish and wildlife, and even winters as we know them in the Adirondacks.
And so changing it just even a degree, we've seen noticeable changes in the snowpack across the Adirondacks, the spread of invasive species, and some of the ecosystems struggling to adapt as the climate warms. We have been able to detect a number of impacts that we know that are being caused by climate change, not by something else. One of the examples, a shortening of the winter period. So fall is lasting longer into the later part of the year, and spring is coming a little bit earlier. And it might not seem like it's coming earlier, but we have to kind of remind ourselves that things were actually quite different 50 to 100 years ago.
And along with the shorter winters, the other seasons may see more severe rainstorms, like those that devastated the Mountain Valley towns of Keene and Jay in 2011. And while there hasn't been as much temperature change in the spring and fall, the change during the winter months has been the most significant, especially over the past 40 years since the Olympics were in Lake Placid. It comes as no surprise to Alexandria Elliott, who says she has seen the changes in the winters over the years at her grandfather's home in the Adirondacks.
I grew up playing in the snow, and I have memories from the early 90s, where snowbanks were taller than my grandfather's outstretched hands, and I thought that it was just childhood imaginings because everything seems bigger when you're small. But then I actually found photographs my mom has from the late 80s and the early 90s that confirmed that these weren't just childhood imaginings, that these were actually my memories, and to know that those winters are gone, that we've already exceeded the threshold, is very heartbreaking for me. I think that the most important thing for the Adirondacks to consider right now is climate resiliency, how we can adapt to these changes and still thrive and still have a sustainable economy.
And that is a concern. Adirondack communities like Lake Placid that depend on winter sports and recreation are already adjusting to a shorter, warmer winter season. Our Jack LeDuc has more on that.
Thousands of visitors ski Whiteface every winter. It employs hundreds and brings in millions of dollars annually, weather permitting. A warming climate could be disastrous for ski areas, not only in Lake Placid, but worldwide. Warm spells in areas without snowmaking equipment could spell their doom. A call for action has gone out to stem climate change. At Whiteface Mountain, officials are taking action. They no longer depend on Mother Nature for snow, they make it themselves.
We've set ourselves up to not have to rely on Mother Nature's snow. So anytime we get some natural snow, it's great, but our system is set up to make snow and take as much advantage of those smaller windows of opportunity that we have to blanket the mountain with man-made snow. So we rely on our man-made snow, and if Mother Nature can kick in a little bit, it only makes it a better experience for the skiers and riders.
The infrastructure has 50 miles of water-carrying pipe leading to scores of snowmaking machines. Whiteface has a 98% snowmaking capability, covering 25 miles of trails.
Climate change is a reality for our business, and we are trying to be as proactive as we can, being prepared as we can be to be a ski resort and deal with this weather that's all over the place. These windows of opportunity sometimes are 2 days long where we can make snow, and we need to be able to make as much snow as we can in those 2 days to get trails open.
Snowmakers often work around the clock, building up a long-lasting base, lengthening the ski season.
We've got to deal with it, Jack. Whether you identify it as man-made or not, the data that's out there certainly supports that our climate is warming. There's no doubt about it. We look at the amount of rain, we look at all the other indicators, and 30% of our economy here is based on winter activity. And so that is something that can affect this region tremendously.
In Lake Placid, motel operators at the Golden Arrow are taking steps to help the environment.
We've been really focusing on sustainability since 2005. Most of the major things, actually, what we found is that we were already doing a lot of the things that they recommended we do, like, for example, low flow showers and toilets, or the beach at the Golden Arrow, which is made out of crushed limestone, which really helps the health of the lake. A lot of things like that we found we were doing already.
Lake Placid will hold the popular World University Games here in 2023, using as much green technology as possible, putting the United States in the environmental spotlight. Warmer weather could mean an extended summer tourism season, but it will call for changes from everyone.
It's going to be our actions that can at least slow down this climate change. And those actions are numerous, and I think the rapidly changing technology now, along with the political winds changing, is over the next 10 to 15 years, everybody's going to take a different angle on climate change.
How nature reacts to warming temperatures is another concern. Volunteers will be heading to the summits of the high peaks this month in search of migratory songbirds that nest in some of the highest elevations of the Adirondacks. The data they collect will help researchers working to protect those birds, including the elusive and rare Bicknell's thrush, whose nesting grounds have been threatened by pollution, development, and now many worry, climate change.
First pole set, just going to run it out, keeping tension on it. To the other end, it's 12 meters long.
Biologist Chris Rimmer with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies spends summers high atop Mount Mansfield, setting up these nylon nets.
We're trying to learn basically about the health of the bird populations that nest on these mountaintops.
And while the nets capture several types of migratory songbirds that live in these alpine forests, they are looking for one bird in particular.
The Bicknell's thrush is one of the most rare species of songbirds in eastern North America. About 100,000 or so in the world. It's a vulnerable community of birds. These habitats are vulnerable to many different factors from, climate change especially.
After hours of catching warblers and an unhappy robin,
robins complain more than some other species.
Rimmer finds a prized catch in the net.
This is our primary quarry, the wily and rare Bicknell's thrush.
Rimmer and his team study these migratory songbirds not only here in the mountaintops where they nest and spend their summers, but also a handful of islands in the Caribbean where they winter and where their native forests are under constant threat from development and now a changing climate.
The whole issue of climate change is the sort of overlaying threat that we're most profoundly worried about in the long term. You know, these habitats at both ends, in the north here and in the south there, are threatened by climate change, by a warming climate, which is predicted to push the mountaintop forests higher and higher, which is happening.
With warming temperatures, the balsam fir forest in the high peaks and northeast mountain ranges where the Bicknells nest may begin to shrink.
The hardwood forests, which are sort of the lower end of these coniferous mountaintop forests, are encroaching upslope. I mean, there is empirical evidence that that is occurring. Some species that are more typical of lower elevations are beginning to creep up, like Swainson's thrush, maybe yellow-bellied flycatcher.
Have we seen anything direct? Not yet. There's been some discussion about, and some, anecdotal observations by us and others of things like Swainson's thrush, very closely related to Bicknell's thrush, that there's more of them at higher elevations than there used to be. We don't have the hard data yet for that, but it does look like, to me, after 25 years of running around up there, that there are places where I did not have Swainson's thrushes. That was too high up for them. They're sort of a lower elevation montane species, and they're mixing more, it seems, in some places with Bicknell's thrush. What will happen with that? How do they compete? There probably is going to be some competition there.
Getting a definitive answer could take years because Bicknells are so rare and elusive. What will help answer those questions is data being collected by teams of citizen scientists who are part of Mountain Bird Watch. Every June, these volunteers fan out across the Northeast to monitor bicknells and 9 other migratory songbirds on 130 trails high in the mountaintops. Jason Hill is the director of the project.
Mountain Bird Watch has been invaluable to giving us insight into where we need to dedicate our effort over the next 10, 20 years. To document the effects of climate change on vertebrate species, you need long-term monitoring data set, like Mountain Bird Watch can do. And that's actually will become a big part of my focus over the next 2 or 3 years, is looking at elevational shifts in the birds that we monitor, and as well as latitudinal shifts. It's the center of their distribution moving northwards.
The volunteers have collected more than 20,000 observations over the past 20 years, which will help researchers like Chris Rimmer and Kent McFarlane answer questions about what impact climate change is having long-term on the bicknell's thrush and other migratory songbirds that live in these alpine forests.
It's going to take a while to really understand what's happening. And, we want to know if things are different in New York versus New Hampshire, which are the 2 areas that have really the mother lode of breeding bicknell thrush, the Adirondacks and the White Mountains.
Those citizen scientists will be collecting hundreds more observations this month to share with Mountain Bird Watch. We are joined this week by a panel to discuss how climate change is impacting the Adirondacks. Dr. Eric Leibensperger, who we just heard from a few moments ago, is a climate scientist at the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at SUNY Plattsburgh. Dr. Leanne Sporn is a biologist at Paul Smith's College. Brendan Kurian is the director of the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. And Willie Janeway is the executive director of the Adirondack Council, the largest conservation group covering the Adirondacks. Welcome to you all. Appreciate you being here. Eric, let's start with you and the warming that we're seeing in the Adirondacks. You have weather data dating back more than a century now, to the early 1900s, that showed this increase of nearly 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Much of that change just within the past few decades?
Yeah, what we've found by looking at some of the old records and looking and coupling it with the more modern records that we have is that the climate has really been accelerating in its change. The warming has most rapidly occurred since the 1980s, 1990s, and to the present day. Not to say that we didn't have warming early on, but the warming has definitely accelerated. And these records, are what we find in the Adirondacks. We find it in the North Country of New York. We find it all across North America, all across the Northern Hemisphere, all across the globe. And so what we're seeing in the Adirondacks here is just a microcosm of what's happening on a global scale.
And mostly during the winter months? Is that when it's happening?
That's correct. So the largest warming that we've been seeing are in the winter and fall months. Kind of the fall, summer extending a little bit more into the fall, and the winter months being a little mild in general than they have in the past. That doesn't mean that we haven't had some cold winters in the last few years, but on average, what we expect, we look at the climate record, which is looking at the long-term and what ecosystems and people can expect, we've noticed warming, especially in the winter seasons.
And why the winter? Why do you believe that's happening?
So the winter seasons actually are what we would expect of a climate that's being changed by greenhouse gases. In the winter, we have longer time periods where we have the sun down, and so a lot of clear skies. And so those periods are when the greenhouse effect is really the most potent. And in the wintertime, we've been noticing that. The coldest days in the winter have been not quite as cold as they have been in the past. And it's been an increase where the winters are kind of rising above any other season.
So it's not that we're seeing hotter days during the summer, that our hotter days are getting hotter. It's that our colder days, our coldest days, are not quite as cold as they used to be.
Yeah, so the warm days are definitely getting a little bit more, but it's really the cold days. You're right. The minimum temperatures, the lowest lows are not quite as low as they used to be.
And you mentioned in the story we saw just a few moments ago, if business stays as usual, if things don't change, you believe we're going to see this increase rapidly, that within the next 20, 30 years, we could see another 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, the trajectory that we're going right now on a global scale is what scientists typically study as the worst case option, business as usual. And the business as usual has us right now, as you mentioned, warming about 2 degrees in the coming decades, which is rapid. It's a fast change. And it's one of the reasons why we're concerned about climate change, is because the climate is what we expect. It's what's expected. And if we're changing what's expected, nature does not know exactly what to do.
Lake Champlain doesn't freeze over as much as it used to. It did freeze over this winter, but are we now seeing a pattern where that freeze is coming later in the season and the ice maybe isn't as thick as it used to be?
Yeah, so our observations show us that Lake Champlain is not freezing over nearly as much as it once did. I think earlier in the early part of the 20th century, it would regularly freeze over almost every year, and it was almost a special event when it didn't freeze over. And now, what we're seeing is that it freezes over once every 3 years to 3 or 4 years, which is a much lower frequency than we saw in the past. And on top of that, the ice is thinner, we believe. Records of ice thickness are not as great as we would like them to be, but we believe the ice is thinner, and the ice season is definitely getting shorter. If you think of our last season here in 2019, the lake did freeze over, but it was only at the very end of the season. It was only for actually a few weeks, or a week or two, that it was actually deemed frozen over before melting again.
Willie, with the shorter, warmer winters, as we saw in Jack's piece, this is forcing Whiteface and other ski resorts to adapt to these changing seasons. The state of New York operates Whiteface and Gore Mountains. Did they, or do the folks that operate the mountains, did they see this coming, and are they doing a good job at adapting to the changing winters?
The state clearly knows that the threat of climate change. The leaders of New York State are no longer debating whether or not it's happening. They're debating instead what we need to actually do. So they are taking aggressive action. They're still arguing over exactly which plans to implement. Whether or not that's going to be enough to save the winter recreational economy in the Adirondacks, it's really too early to know. But the first part of addressing the problem is acknowledging it, stopping the debate about it, and moving to the debate about solutions.
And as we saw in Jack's piece, they're investing in snowmaking equipment, certainly at Whiteface. They're saying the majority, they believe, of the snow that they have there will be man-made snow.
And that will buy time, but whether or not that by itself is enough, most folks would suggest no. So the state is doing more than investing in those facilities and snowmaking. It's also looking more comprehensively as how New York, teaming up with other states, can still implement the Paris Accord, how New York State can still lead on doing the other things, reducing emissions, improving their resiliency. So that the state has a good vision, and its leaders in the legislature and in the governor's office very much understand the issue. Whether or not we'll get everything aligned and the resources to act fast enough, the state tends to, like any state, act incrementally, and this is a problem where incremental solutions are not going to do it. Climate change is going to really be devastating to the Adirondack region as we know it in a lot of ways. Some parts will survive, but a lot of what we value here will be severely impacted. So that the state has flagged the problem and is starting to move, but a lot more needs to still happen.
A lot of ski resorts may not be able to afford the equipment that they need to the degree to make the amount of snow that they'll need. Certainly there are also cross-country ski trails, there's snowmobiling, there's snowshoeing. Some cross-country ski centers around the Northeast, including Mount Van Hoevenberg, are investing in equipment to make snow to cover the trails. But for the others, what sort of impact could we see overall on regions like the Lake Placid, the Tri-Lakes, the Adirondacks?
We've been seeing some of the smaller places, think Big Tupper, not be able to stay open without snowmaking. And we've been seeing Mount Van Hoevenberg start to incorporate snowmaking. That buys some additional time. Hopefully it gives us a window of opportunity to take the other actions that are needed to make sure the problem doesn't get even worse.
The economic impact is huge.
It is. Tourism is the key driver for the economy, for the jobs. I mean, thankfully we have really resilient and intelligent people in the North Country, but it's going to take a lot more on multiple fronts. There's no one thing that will solve it.
We are seeing visitors at other times of the year. Yes. Obviously, hikers are coming in droves. Yes. That's an issue within itself. Yes.
So successful, we have too many. But it's a great thing to have.
And we're seeing other seasons. We're bringing visitors in at other times of the year. But for a long time, really, winter sports have driven the economy in the Adirondacks.
The economy is dependent on a year-round destination that the Adirondacks do provide. But what we provide is going to need to shift and change as climate change changes what we have.
Leanne, Brendan, we're coming to you next. Let's take a quick break, though. When we come back, we're going to discuss the impact climate change is having on invasive species, on the tick population, on our forests and wildlife, as well as what the state and communities are doing to address climate change.
The
climate is changing, and we need places where nature is left alone, where we can watch natural processes work themselves out.
The Adirondacks are one of the largest and most intact temperate mixed deciduous forests left on the globe. And because of that global significance, our obligation to do conservation work here is really important.
And welcome back to Mountain Lake Journal. If you're tuning in looking for New York Now, it will be on at a special time this week, Sunday morning at 5. This week, we are expanding Mountain Lake Journal to a full hour to discuss the effects of climate change on the Adirondacks. We will get to questions and comments from our studio audience in just a few minutes. But first, let's welcome Leanne Sporn, who is a biology professor at Paul Smith College. Dr. Sporn, you have spent the past several years tracking ticks in the Adirondacks. How significant of an increase have we seen in recent years?
Well, I began doing this about 5 years ago, and at that time the common lore was there are no ticks in the Adirondacks, the type that cause disease, that carry disease, that affect humans, maybe along the shores of Lake Champlain, but really in the interior of the park in the North Country, that was the lore. And the data prior to us getting involved really showed that the densities, if they're at all, were incredibly low. But what I've seen over the past 5 years is just an incredibly astounding increase, both in the numbers of ticks and the distribution. So what we're experiencing is a range expansion. It's coming northward and a bit westward, but northward up from the lower Hudson Valley.
And coming into the Adirondacks.
Absolutely.
Were not here in the Adirondacks before.
That's correct.
And not only are they coming further north, but they're climbing into higher elevations?
Up into higher elevations.
And are you seeing a variety of species of ticks, different variations?
Well, there are, I think, 27 tick species in New York State. Most of them we're not really concerned about, and most of them we're not monitoring. We're really focusing on the black-legged tick or deer tick that carries human pathogens.
And that's the
predominant tick in this area of the state, yes.
And that is the biggest worry.
Yes.
There is some concern about what impact ticks are having on wildlife, on moose and others, because if they get so many ticks on them, it can certainly affect their health. But the primary concern, and certainly for you, is human health.
That's correct.
Because of Lyme disease.
Because of Lyme disease. And Lyme disease and several others. Recently, we've detected babesiosis in the park. It's a malaria-like parasite. Who would ever have guessed that you could contract basically malaria in the North Country? We've seen cases of that here in Clinton County. Anaplasmosis, and last year, we did a large study of deer population. We used them as sentinels and discovered the very deadly Powassan virus is present in the North Country as well. So we actually test for 5 different human pathogens in the deer ticks.
But primarily Lyme disease?
What we see is that the incidence of Lyme disease is the highest in this. That's the most common tick-borne disease by far in the North Country, but the numbers of human cases and the percentage of ticks that are infected with the other diseases that I mentioned is increasing as well.
And are people just waking up to the fact that Lyme disease is here and that potentially they can get it? And is the medical community just becoming aware that Lyme disease is here?
I think both. Like I said, it's sort of the common lore. It takes a long time to change that. People come to the park to visit, often from areas where ticks and tick-borne diseases are endemic because they think there are no ticks here. And the population might be less and more patchy than where they might be from in other areas of the state. So that puts people at particular risk if we don't get the word out that, yes, there is this risk here. And the number of cases in humans is steadily rising almost exponentially here in the park. And the incidence rate is really some of the highest in the state right now in this area, which is very surprising because our tick densities are still quite low.
The deer tick that carries it, the overwhelming majority of them carry Lyme disease, or is there no way of knowing what percentage of deer ticks carry it?
No, we do. We collect enough ticks from sites throughout the whole North Country every year that we know that about half of adult ticks are infected with Lyme disease here. About 10% are infected with babesiosis, the malaria-like parasite, and about 10% with anaplasmosis. And interestingly, you mentioned the medical community. Diagnosing these is very difficult. It's a clinical diagnosis. It's one that can't be identified early with a blood test. It requires the healthcare provider to know what they're looking for. So the context is important, and that's the most important piece of information that they need to protect the health of visitors and residents is if these diseases are present. Is there a local risk of acquiring these diseases? And that's the information that we try to provide. And indeed there is.
And the information that you provide with the health department in New York State has been critical for a number of years now. This year, though, for the first time in the legislature, your funding has dried up, and it does not appear that the legislature is going to give you the funding you need to continue on.
That is correct. There was a task force that was put together by the New York State Senate that was disbanded, I guess, for a while when the Senate switched parties. We did lobby hard to get the funding restored to that task force, but it was cut at the last minute. So at this current time, there is no Senate funding for any of this work. I might also point out that in these counties here in the Adirondacks, because of our low year-round population, we really don't have fully staffed local county health departments. In fact, Franklin, Essex, and Hamilton counties don't have any environmental component to the health department. So we're really serving as an extension to what the state can do because they just don't have the capacity to monitor. So as climate change continues, there's going to be more and more of a need to have this information. We have a low year-round population, but we have millions and millions of visitors to the park every year. And it's our responsibility to protect their health as well as our residents.
You mentioned the adult ticks pass it on. Can the nymphs, can the small ticks also pass along Lyme disease?
And we're just heading into nymph season now. They're small and they're hard to detect, but the vast majority of human cases come from bite of a nymph. Maybe because the biology, they might be better at transmitting Lyme, or people might not notice that they are being bitten by a nymphal tick. They're the size of poppy seeds.
And is that a case then that people may not know they've been bitten? Because often we hear about look for the target, that
but not everyone gets
telltale
that.
sign
Yes,
that you've been bitten by a tick. But if it's a nymph, you may not actually see that.
You might not. And most of the tick-borne diseases look the same clinically, and they look like other diseases. They're often fairly nondescript symptoms. So knowing what the local risk is incredibly important.
And seeing the increase that you've seen over the past few years, is there any doubt in your mind what's driving the tick population north?
It's a very good point. A lot of people believe it's increases in deer population. It's really not driving that range expansion. So what's driving the ticks into new territories, which we're at the heart of, we're in the leading edge of that range expansion, is definitely climate change. So what Eric mentioned about the warmer winter weather, that's critical. The ticks have to overwinter. They have a 2-year life cycle. So they're able to do that. They're able to have more, they like moisture. They dry out readily. So the warmer, wetter climate is definitely causing the expansion.
And in the past, it was just too cold for them to get this far north.
Likely. Didn't have enough suitable time to see coasts and that sort of
And while
thing.
the ticks are certainly a major threat, there are at least 2 other forest pests that are spreading closer to the Adirondack Park. One is already here, the Hemlock woolly Adelgid, which was found in a small cluster of trees in Lake George in 2017. If it spreads and gets a foothold, it could threaten millions of hemlock trees in the park. So far, scientists have been able to contain it using pesticide to control it. The other worry is a beetle called the emerald ash borer, which has crossed the St. Lawrence River from Canada and has been found in St. Lawrence and Franklin counties just north of the park. That pest tunnels its way into ash trees. It's killed tens of thousands of ash trees in Montreal and in both Quebec and Ontario. Brendan, as director of the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, you work to prevent these and other invasive species from getting into the Adirondack Park. So far, so good with the Hemlock woolly Adelgid. Is the hope that you've been able to contain it to just those few trees, and so far it hasn't spread any further into the park?
That's the hope. It is a near-term or short-term solution to be able to treat individual trees with pesticides to address this insect. We do know that the winters are getting warmer, and similar to the tick situation, that Hemlock woolly Adelgid is being able to expand its range into areas where it once was unable to. So it's really a matter of time as far as when we find it in other locations in the park, and that's why it's so important to develop long-term solutions for this insect. Cornell University is currently developing a biocontrol agent, and we're hopeful that that can be released in large quantities over the landscape, but that's really going to take decades to develop and have in abundance to release. So they're looking at a beetle, Laricobius nigrinus, as well as a silverfly, and the hope is that these can be released. They will control Hemlock woolly Adelgid and reduce populations without affecting anything else. The challenge is rearing enough beetles to address something that could potentially wipe out all hemlocks across the northeast. It spreads parthenogenically, so it only takes one insect to create a population of thousands or millions of individuals. So we need to create enough biocontrol agents to suppress those infestations of Hemlock woolly Adelgid so that they don't impact our hemlock trees.
And the emerald ash borer is a concern. It hasn't technically made it into the Adirondack Park, but it's certainly knocking at the door in Franklin and St. Lawrence counties.
It is, and really that one was a matter of time. It's not so much limited by climate, although very cold winters can reduce populations. It's really primarily spread in firewood, in wood packing material, and it's a good flyer. So it can fly long distances and spread into new areas very quickly.
So in the case of the emerald ash borer, the hemlock woolly adelgid, and the Asian clam, which has now spread to certain parts of Lake George, an aquatic invasive species, the thought is that the winters not being quite as cold may give them more of a chance to survive.
Exactly. We didn't think that hemlock woolly adelgid or Asian clam would be able to survive in the Adirondacks, and yet here they are. So they are harbingers of what is to come. We do expect other species that are farther south right now to move northward, species like kudzu or other ones that we've never had to deal with before. So climate change is making things much more complicated in the invasive species realm.
And I was going to ask you about plants. Are there particular plants you're watching? Is hydrilla something that is at all affected by climate change and warming temperatures, or is that more likely just the danger that that's going to arrive on a boat somewhere, as we saw in Saranac Lake a couple of years ago, and nearly getting into Upper Saranac Lake? Is that a plant that's not necessarily affected by changing temperatures?
Well, we know it's doing very well in Florida right now, so climate change will certainly help it. It's probably not the main driver of expansion of that species. I think it could probably do pretty well in Adirondack lakes right now, but I think it would do better.
And Eric, speaking of aquatic invasive species, you also monitor water temperatures in Lake Champlain during the summer months and compare them to records over the past 25 years or so. What are you finding with those water temperatures? Are you also seeing an increase in the temperature of Lake Champlain?
Yeah, we've been studying Lake Champlain and using the records that have been collected as part of the long-term monitoring program that has been funded by the US EPA and the Vermont and New York DECs. And what we've been finding is that the lake is warming. It's not too surprising that it's warming because the air is warming, but what is a little bit surprising to us is how quickly the water is warming. It's warming at a rate that almost matches the air temperature. So over the last 25 years or so, we've seen warming of about 1.5 degrees or so of warming in the summer season, which is alarming. And we project into the future, looking ahead, that by end of the century we could see another 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming in the water, which will have important consequences for the ecosystems and what species will thrive and which ones might kind of be pushed out.
We've always heard that with warming temperatures we may see more algae, blue-green algae, and of course blue-green algae can be toxic at times, so that's probably one concern. What are some of the other concerns that we could see?
Well, there's concerns over kind of invasive species moving in and finding a habitat that might be more favorable to them and kind of allowing them to thrive and kind of prey on local species and push them out. And I think also an important thing about climate change is, we do expect there to be time periods where, especially in the summer, where there are some hot periods and there are some calm periods, and those hot, sunny periods are right for algae blooms, as you mentioned. And so as these temperatures warm, it makes things conducive for water quality to be degraded. And it kind of puts what we tend to call a climate change penalty on our ability to improve water quality and air quality as well. Our efforts to improve our water quality and air quality are there. We've reduced emissions. We're doing all of these things to reduce phosphorus in the lake and to reduce air pollutants. But climate change can jeopardize the efficacy of some of those measures.
With the warmer temperatures in the lake, we hear so much about the shipwrecks, the historic shipwrecks, way down in the cold, cold waters. Does it get to a point where they could be impacted by these changing temperatures, or is this so far up closer to the surface that it really wouldn't have an effect?
The largest amount of warming that we've seen and what we'd expect to see is near the surface. And actually what might happen in the summer seasons is more of a decoupling or kind of a segmentation of the lake where the top layer and the bottom layer don't interact with each other very much, which also is important for water quality. But that also means that some of the shipwrecks that are down there in the bottom will be less perturbed by things that happen at the surface. And so they actually might see a little bit of the benefit and be protected.
And Leanne, I don't know, being a biologist, if this may be more for you, but we've heard from folks that they've seen possums here in the Adirondacks, and that's new, that they haven't seen possums this far north in New York. So are we seeing other species that we're seeing migrate north as well?
Yeah, I think we were chatting about this prior, and Brendan, I think, noted that the possum is susceptible to frostbite, so it wasn't a suitable habitat for it here, but now is.
As species are pushed out northward, we're getting other species from the south moving in. And those could be bad species like invasive species or ticks that are causing human health impacts, but they could also be beneficial species. Species like red oak or possums may do much better in the Adirondacks longer term.
And we talk about the forest, and you mentioned the trees. We heard a little bit before in our piece about the boreal forest in the Adirondacks. Biologists we talked with at the Vermont Center for Eco Studies say they're already seeing a shrinking of these forests in the Catskills. Will other trees like hardwoods, as you mentioned, move further north into the higher elevations? Are we going to see a changing of the forest?
Definitely. So it is likely that we could lose the boreal forest, but we're not going to lose the forest. There's always going to be trees. Forests are very resilient, so as long as there are species to recolonize, they will. So I would anticipate our tree species transitioning from things like sugar maple, red maple, to red oak, white oak. So the forest will be here, it'll just look different, and it'll provide different benefits.
And so people will pick up on one of the things you said, though, sugar maple. So could we see a dramatic change in the maple industry as we know it here in the northern New York and the Adirondacks?
Long term, yes. If as business as usual continues, we could be having our forest transition to things very similar to Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, perhaps. So in those states, there is no sugar maple industry right now.
Are there any upsides to warming temperatures? Will it extend the growing season here in the Adirondacks, and could that be good for farmers and gardeners? Or is it likely that with the changing weather patterns that we're seeing, that farmers with that changing climate are going to see the challenges of a lot more severe weather and heavy rainstorms that they're going to have to deal with as well?
Yes, there are upsides, and you can talk to different experts in different areas and they'll identify some, and they're usually quick to say, but there's a lot more downsides. And when you make it the list of the downsides, the weight is heavily on that side.
I think it's the rapidity of change that is so worrisome. Change is good, change is always happening, but when you were disrupting habitat and disrupting ecosystems and change is happening so quickly, unexpected things happen. So I think I've had the privilege of watching the emergence of these tick populations very, very rapidly, and that's not been a good thing for human health. So anytime you disrupt the equilibrium out there, unexpected things might happen. So.
And with that change, one of the most important things is to build resilience, or the capacity for a system to transition well through that change, or be able to withstand the effects of climate change better than if nothing was done. So really the work that we're focusing on is building resilience of these systems so that they're better able to cope with the effects of climate change.
And we talk about the species that we could see changing. Could we see human refugees heading for the Adirondacks to get away from the coastline and some of the coastal cities and other areas that are impacted by climate change?
We see some of that now, and we definitely expect on a global scale to see large population movements within many of our lifetimes.
We want to mention, we did invite the state of New York, both NYSERDA and DEC, to join us, but they both declined. So Willie, we turn to you as the conservation group that keeps an eye on the Adirondacks and watches over the state. How has the state responded to climate change? What sort of action plans are in place or being proposed to get us to use more renewable energy and to cut the size of our carbon footprint?
Well, you're picking on me too, because as you know, Tom, I'm also a former official with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, where I served for 6 years. And when you talk to the people inside the state, 15 years ago, the New York State DEC did not have a climate office. We do now. We did not have an invasive species office. We do now. And we have really dedicated professionals working with nowhere near the resources they need, but well aware of the challenges they face. And there's a lot of reason for our audience to get pessimistic listening to the ticks, the invasive species. The science is irrefutable. But there's also reason for optimism. And when you talk to the people working in the state, they think about how before 1990, our lakes had been killed off by acid rain. The loons were gone, the ravens were gone. If you saw a bald eagle, it was probably stuffed in a museum. And 30 years later, we have turned that around. We have trout back, we have loons back. And it's because of actions taken at the state level, at the federal level, beyond. And so while there's a huge sense of intimidation by the size of this challenge, there's also a sense of we've done this before. This is bigger. And so there are folks working hard at the state level to try and replicate at a much larger scale the success we've had on acid rain, on a global level and not wait for a Trump administration in Washington that seems to be going in the wrong direction. Not wait on national consensus, but to move here in New York. So that the state, I think, fully embraces the challenge they have and are aspiring to lead.
You just mentioned it. Could some of those gains be jeopardized now?
Yes, one of the challenges because of acid rain is even though you see a lot of recovery, it's like a cancer patient that has recovered. The underlying buffering capacity of our soils in the Adirondacks is not what it was before acid rain. So just a small increase in some other stresses could have much larger that scaled up impacts negative for the environment, which impacts the tourism, impacts the quality of life, impacts health, the other issues that we're having. So yeah, there's a whole potential cascading negative effect there. But the good news is that people have identified that and realized that. And you have work that the Nature Conservancy has been doing, that Brendan is looking at. One part of the solution is to protect our natural systems. You have Paul Smith's, you have the SUNY system, you have a lot of institutions that the state thankfully is able to lean on because they don't have all the resources they need themselves.
The state's goals for renewable energy, 2030, 2050, realistic? That we can get to 70% by 2030, 100% by 2050?
I think those are doable, and we've got to have bold goals. One of the challenges right now in Albany at this time that we're taping this program is that there are competing proposals, and there's a challenge to be more ambitious, but what is really needed is a New Deal that is realistic and ambitious. And so we are hopeful, and again, a lot of organizations are working together with the state to try and marry the best of legislative and executive proposals before the end of June, so that the state has a new law that actually codifies in law the goals that are being set. Right now, the state's goals are, with only a few exceptions, are basically not codified in law, and that's a weakness.
Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is one of the few Republicans on Capitol Hill who says climate change is real and could very soon, in parts of the world, become a serious threat to our national security. During a trip to the North Country last week, the Congresswoman sat down with us to talk about the need to address climate change.
It is urgent, and it's a generational issue. I'm one of the younger members of Congress, no longer the youngest, but this is something that my generation is going to inherit. I've been a leader when it comes to not only the acknowledgement of climate change, but also the focus on science-based solutions. I've been a leader when it comes to promoting renewable energy, both nationally but specifically in the district. I've supported solar and wind tax credits. I also believe that we should have more of a level playing field with other renewable energy resources when it comes to tax incentives. Opportunities like biomass or hydro, those are clean energy sources that we need to be incentivizing their utilization.
If you go to our website, you can watch more of our interview with Congresswoman Stefanik and hear why she opposes a carbon tax or the Green New Deal as ways to tackle climate change, and instead believes tax credits and incentives will help promote the use of renewable energy.
Is an incentive program like that enough, do you think?
It's a key part of the solution, and it would be a big step forward. More than that is ultimately needed, but we need to take every step we can. And the Congresswoman, as a Republican leader in the House, has an opportunity to help advance and make sure some of those proposals actually get turned into law, that actually happen and go the right way. Ultimately, the way to evaluate any elected official is not by what they're saying and what they're promising, but what they're delivering. And Congresswoman Stefanik, as many people around Lake Champlain know, teamed up last year with Congressman Welch from Vermont and secured an additional $4 million for a total of $8.4 million in funding for Lake Champlain. If we can do something like that at a larger scale, then she will have delivered what her district and her people need.
We welcome our audience now to join in.
I have a two-part question, part for Willie and part for you, Leanne. Do we have enough baseline data to measure change in terms of vegetation in the Adirondacks, in terms of tree species? Have we done a BioBlitz, for instance, on a section that we can go back to and measure repeatedly over the near future and distant future to look for change in terms of speciation, tree speciation? That's part of the question. And the other part would be insects. There was a study done in Germany a year or two ago that was published, and they used an entomology group that was collecting masses of insects in some kind of a trap. And someone went back and looked at that data and found that there was an 83% drop in the mass of insects in this one locale. Do we have data on, or are we collecting data on insect mass?
I think what you're a proponent of is long-term monitoring.
Yes.
And as a scientist, I'm very frustrated at lack of funding for monitoring work. It's not considered science, and it's often not fundable by agencies like National Science Foundation. The work I do, I think, is so critical to protect people directly. Our work goes right into the clinic,
Right.
but we can't get funding to do it.
Right.
And so I would put out a call for a little bit more awareness of need for long-term monitoring.
And I would say, when I was working for New York State DEC, it seemed like we didn't have the resources we needed to be able to do the kind of monitoring to help us make sure we were making good decisions. And now as an advocate, it's more clear than ever. The success over the last 30 years with acid rain has actually unfortunately led to a huge cut in the dollars available for the type of long-term monitoring. So we're struggling with how to use the acid rain monitoring to try and look at climate change, and what we really need to be doing is investing more than we are currently investing in long-term monitoring of the things that 10 and 20 years from now we wish we had been measuring this summer. And so while there is some really good monitoring going on, and there are some great people and nonprofits doing pieces of that, it's underfunded. There's not the kind of comprehensive system there should be.
So one of the most comprehensive data sets nationally is conducted by the U.S. Forest Service, and is the Forest Inventory and Assessment Program. So that data set has been in existence for several decades. Again, it's not nearly as robust as it should be. But there are plots stationed throughout the Adirondacks that have been evaluating that change over time. The only issue is you have to evaluate at the county scale because of the coarseness of the data. There are only 1 or 2 plots per county in most cases.
Well, one of the ironies of that data set, if I may, is even as limited as it is, one of the things we can do to fight climate change is sequester more carbon. And the Adirondacks should be really good at that. We have a lot of trees, we have a lot of forest. But it looks as if the rate of sequestration going on in the Adirondacks is well below the rate happening statewide, which means we need to update our incentives for growing trees and better manage the forests that we do have to bring up that level of sequestration to help not only the Adirondacks but help the state meet its goals of carbon neutrality. But that will be guided by more science than we have now.
Tell us about the climate initiatives that you folks are working on at the Wild Center.
So the work that we do is primarily focused on young people, high school students. So what we do is we convene, engage, and inspire young people to learn about the climate science, the local impacts, many of which we're hearing about tonight, and then to focus on solutions in their schools and communities.
The Youth Climate Summit. That's been going almost 10 years now.
Actually, we're in our 11th year.
Are you really?
So we've been, we've done now 10 summits. So we're in our 11th year. We've actually helped to inspire around 70 youth climate summits globally. So the program has really taken off. And so we work with, in the North Country, work with about 30 to 40 different school districts that all now have green teams established, that have high school teachers working with their students to help support projects that the students come up with. So they're student driven, they're solutions focused, it's very hopeful, and they're working on problems that directly address issues that they are of critical concern to them in their school and their communities.
For us, for people here tonight in the audience, what can we do? What are some of the individual things we can do?
There are lots of things that we can do. I'm so glad you asked that question. It's really important to take action at home, certainly as individuals, but we really are trying to focus on now. I mean, and those actions can be all sorts of things, like looking at your energy efficiency, looking at your waste stream, like where does your waste go, how much waste are you using? Food waste is a big one, so thinking about how can you compost or how can you get your food into a composting program. So there's lots of individual actions that we can take, but we really need to move from me to we and really start thinking collectively about solutions at a community, county, region, state scale. So those are the things we're thinking about now. And actually some of our students are working in partnership with New York State's Office of Climate Change to help communities to become climate smart communities. And that actually happened in April here in Plattsburgh. Some of the students from Plattsburgh's green team, an amazing green team, the teacher's here in the audience, shout out to her. But they approached the city council and asked the city to become to take the climate smart community pledge. And what that will do, once a community, and any community in New York can do this, there's over 250 communities already registered. Once they pledge to do that, it opens them up to free technical support. It opens them up to funding opportunities through the state to be more resilient, to help look at mitigation and adaptation, and then they can start going through a certification process. So we actually have communities in the Adirondacks that have students on their task forces and helping communities and being at the table where communities are making decisions and thinking about solutions and how we can build a greener, safe, and more sustainable place.
And if folks would like to see a good example of how students can make a difference, there's a documentary produced a few years ago called The Resilient Ones, A Generation Takes on Climate Change. It'll be on our website. It's also online. Folks can go and watch that. That's a great story of how students came together and really are making a difference.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
And our thanks to our audience, our panel, and those of you watching at home. You'll find all of our recent stories and a recent talk from renowned climate change author Bill McKibben on our website, along with tonight's full forum. For all of us at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Hellick. Thanks for watching.
Mountain Lake Journal on Mountain Lake PBS is made possible in part by
Northline Utilities creates employment and training opportunities for North Country residents with projects that build community and social infrastructure. We're family-focused and education-oriented. Power is our business and pride is our choice.
Knight Automotive, featuring a full selection of the entire Buick lineup in stock, with certified technicians in our service department and a well-stocked parts department. Knight Automotive, Route 3, Plattsburgh, New York. Lakes to Locks Passage, working to stimulate the health and vibrancy of our communities through nurturing our culture and heritage. Discover local history and unique travel ideas for New York's Great Northeast Journey at lakestolocks.org. The team at International Paper Ticonderoga Mill proudly supports Lakes to Locks Passage and Mountain Lake PBS.
Twin State Technologies. The cyber threat tempo, including ransomware, is real. Twin State Technologies provides trusted, innovative services that replace, augment, or update your existing system. Our goal is to stop hacking before it starts. Implementing big business solutions geared for the small business market. Twin State Technologies. Connect, protect, respond. More at twinstate.com.
The climate is changing, and we need places where nature is left alone, where we can watch natural processes work themselves out.
The Adirondacks are one of the largest and most intact temperate mixed deciduous forests left on the globe. And because of that global significance, our obligation to do conservation work here is really important.
This program is part of Peril and Promise, a national public media initiative from WNET in New York, exploring the impact of climate change here in the Adirondacks and around the world.